Thank you very much, Josh, and thanks to everyone who's with us today. Um, I'll try not to go on too long because I'd very much like to give you all a chance to ask questions. Yes, I'd sort of have a career with one foot in the practitioner camp and one foot a little bit as the ex-anthropology, social anthropology student who observes and watches or tries to watch a bit more objectively what's going on. I'm going to talk in four parts. Briefly, very briefly, I'm going to talk about what's gone well and what's gone less well over the past couple of decades. And then probably the main part I want to draw your attention to is why have there been drawbacks, or what in a volume back in 2007 we called collateral damage caused by anti-trafficking interventions. Then in part three, I'll talk a bit about some specific drawbacks, but I've published on these, others have too, and the conference has touched on quite a lot of adverse human rights impacts. So I won't spend an enormous amount of time on that. And then finally, I will touch on some potential remedies for this downside. And that's because I'm not an academic that can say this is all awful imperialism or awful oppressive government activity. I've met people who've been abused and exploited in horrible ways, and I really want to see something positive done for them. And I think it could be done much better than it is at the moment. So first of all, what's gone well? Compared to the 1990s or the late 20th century, in many countries there's a much better understanding now of what constitutes abusive exploitation. All sorts of methods have been developed for detecting illegal exploitation, extreme exploitation, and to identify the people involved, adults and children. That's been positive for some of them, but not everyone. There's been some good jurisprudence from two regional human rights courts, the European Court of Human Rights that we've heard about in this conference, and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which I talk about mainly because I gave them some evidence in a case back in 2016, a Brazil case. Here's just a couple of references. I'm not going to go into detail because they've been mentioned earlier, of the European Court of Human Rights. It does seem extraordinary, doesn't it, that for a court established 60 years earlier, there'd only been about one not very meaningful case on forced labor in the 20th century. It's only since the UN Trafficking Protocol was adopted that we've really seen the European Court move on the issue of forced labor and human rights. Here are details. Here's the title of the American case, and I've already in the chat boxes yesterday given some references to where the English copy of the judgment is. So those are things that have gone well. And that the point about the regional court cases, of course, is that these are not prosecutions of traffickers. These are prosecutions of states for failing to uphold human rights. And I'm just confirming that because so often there's a real confusion caused by the assertion that human trafficking is a violation of human rights. So let me come back to that in a minute and talk about where there's been a bit of progress, but it's been painfully slow. Well, policymakers, police and others have been very slow to understand what constitutes servitude, forced labor, human trafficking, and so on. Or in the last 6 years since the British decided to rebrand modern slavery. There was the initial assumption, particularly among law enforcement, that it was all about vice and the sex industry. And only earlier this year, I and others were involved in designing yet another course to promote understanding of what trafficking for the purpose of labor exploitation actually consists of, because so little is still done about it. What's been terribly slow and still doesn't happen in most countries is that policymakers don't listen to trafficking victims, adults or children. I wrote a book about this in 2007 or 8, or more or less a book, and I thought it would make a difference, and it made absolutely no difference. So it's been very disillusioning. There's been next to no meaningful prevention, and the things that have been called prevention haven't prevented. So a big problem there. And finally, there's been progress in the mechanisms in many countries to identify trafficked persons as a first step to protecting them, but often very slow, deliberately slow, because people in government don't want to make the protection and assistance available to substantial numbers, and often also because of the reluctance of the people concerned, because there was either no advantage to them in being identified, or there were some very substantial disadvantages to them, as we'll come onto in a moment. So, part 2, why have there been drawbacks? I've got a whole long list, and I'm only going to touch on some of them today. First of all, terminology. Here are just a few points. I've heard complaints about the term vulnerability, which I dislike, already mentioned. The first problem is that trafficking was co-opted to mean something more than recruitment into the commercial sex sector, but that was what it was always understood by police around the world to refer to. Secondly, it was defined as a result of protracted intergovernmental negotiations as a three-stage offence, and in many countries it was put as such straight into the statute books, and it's very difficult to prove all the stages, and it's complicated, and it needn't have been that, because there could have been a focus on the forms of exploitation, in which case recruitment is, or perhaps a first stage, but instead the focus was put on the recruitment into exploitation. Thirdly, again, it's already been raised, the title of the international law referring to trafficking insisted that women and children were the main victims. So men automatically lost out until there was enough evidence to point out there were a lot of them. And I still hear, even at this conference, meaningless statistics coming from organizations that are only reporting on what law enforcement people have identified in terms of victims, that skew the proportions of men, women, boys and girls around in a damaging way. And it's important to remember that back in 2000, there were two protocols to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child adopted as well. One of those was about the sale of children and went into a great deal of detail on protection and definition of offences, and that was effectively shunted aside by the focus on trafficking. Another terminology problem has been introduction of the term modern slavery, and the reason that it was such a problem is because it was parachuted into the Sustainable Development Goals at a late stage by the United Kingdom without ensuring consensus. So the result was that they broke an existing consensus on use of the term trafficking in persons. I suppose there was a strategic objective in all that. I'm not sure what it was. I don't think it's been very helpful. A few more drawbacks. As I said, the term trafficking